In the bustling streets of Nairobi, where the sun paints the city gold and shadows dance with the rhythm of life, there lived a man named David. He was a simple man, known for his easy smile and gentle demeanor. His days were spent toiling in the sweltering heat, working odd jobs to make ends meet. But little did he know, his life was about to take an unexpected turn. David's wife, Sue, was a woman of fierce determination. She carried the weight of their poverty like a heavy burden, her once bright eyes now dimmed by the constant struggle to survive. Each day brought new challenges, and Sue felt the weight of their financial woes pressing down on her shoulders. One evening, as David returned home from another exhausting day, he found Sue waiting for him with a solemn expression on her face. She beckoned him to sit beside her, her hands trembling with anticipation. "David," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have something to tell you." David listened intently as Sue unfolded her plan. With tears in her eyes, she explained how they could no longer afford to make ends meet on his meager income alone. Their bills were piling up, and there seemed to be no end in sight to their financial struggles. "I've been thinking," Sue said hesitantly, what if we could find a way to make some extra money?" David's heart sank as he realized what his wife was suggesting. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You want me to rent myself out?" he stammered, disbelief etched on his face. Sue nodded, her eyes filled with desperation. "Just on the weekends," she pleaded. "Just until we get back on our feet. Please, David, we have no other choice." David felt a whirlwind of emotions raging inside him. He wanted to provide for his family, to ease the burden that weighed so heavily on Sue's shoulders. But the thought of selling his time, his dignity, was almost too much to bear. Before Sue's proposition, David had been a construction worker, taking on any job he could find to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. He had always prided himself on his work ethic and his ability to provide for his family, no matter the odds. But now, faced with Sue's desperate plea, he found himself at a crossroads. Could he set aside his pride for the sake of his family's survival? Could he bear the shame of knowing that he was being rented out like a commodity? As David sat at the table, his mind swelling with uncertainty, he looked into Sue's eyes and saw the fear and desperation reflected in her gaze. And in that moment, he made a decision. "I'll do it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes to take care of us." And with those words, David and Sue embarked on a journey that would test the limits of their love and resilience, as they grappled with the harsh realities of poverty and the sacrifices they were willing to make to survive. The first call came on a dreary Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. Sue hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest with a mixture of apprehension and desperation. "Hello," she answered tentatively. On the other end of the line was Mrs. Jenkins, a wealthy widow who lived in the affluent neighborhood on the outskirts of Nairobi. She had heard about David through a friend of a friend and was intrigued by the prospect of having a strong, capable man to accompany her for the weekend. After a brief conversation, Sue arranged for David to meet Mrs. Jenkins at her luxurious mansion the following morning. As David prepared himself for the encounter, his mind raced with a jumble of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, determined to fulfill his promise to Sue. The next morning, David arrived at Mrs. Jenkins' mansion, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the grand entrance. Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "Welcome, David," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I've been looking forward to our weekend together." As they stepped inside, David couldn't help but marvel at the opulence surrounding him. The mansion was filled with exquisite furnishings and priceless works of art, a stark contrast to the humble surroundings he was accustomed to. Over the course of the weekend, David found himself swept up in a whirlwind of luxury and extravagance as Mrs. Jenkins showered him with attention and affection. They dined at fancy restaurants, attended lavish parties, and indulged in all the pleasures that money could buy. But beneath the surface, David couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that gnawed at him. Despite the material comforts surrounding him, he couldn't escape the nagging sense of guilt that weighed heavily on his conscience. As the weekend drew to a close, David found himself longing for the simplicity of his life with Sue, where love and family were the true treasures. And so, when Mrs. Jenkins dropped him off at his humble abode on Sunday evening, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. "Thank you for a lovely weekend, David," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice tinged with sadness. David nodded, offering her a polite smile before stepping out of the car and watching as she drove away into the night. And as he turned to face his modest home. As the days passed, word of David's weekend rental services spread throughout Nairobi, attracting the attention of another wealthy widow named Jane. She had heard whispers of David's charm and rugged good looks, and she was eager to experience his companionship for herself. One sunny afternoon, as Sue was busy tending to her chores, there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by the sight of Jane standing on her doorstep, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Is David home?" Jane asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Sue's heart sank as she realized why Jane was there. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile onto her face as she invited Jane inside. "David's out at the moment," Sue replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But he should be back soon. Please, come in." As they waited for David to return, Jane couldn't help but shower Sue with compliments, praising her for landing such a handsome and charming man. "You're a lucky woman, Sue," Jane said, her voice dripping with envy. "David is quite the catch, with his six-pack abs and chiseled chest." Sue forced a polite smile, her heart heavy with sorrow as she watched Jane fawn over her husband. She couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, knowing that David would soon be whisked away by another woman for yet another weekend of luxury and indulgence. When David finally returned home, Jane wasted no time in making her intentions clear. She offered him a generous sum of money in exchange for his companionship for the weekend, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Unable to refuse the offer, David reluctantly agreed, knowing that he had made a promise to Sue that he couldn't break. As Sue looked on, her heart breaking into a million pieces, she accepted the money that Jane offered, knowing that it was the only way to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. And so, as David and Jane drove off into the sunset, leaving Sue behind with a heavy heart and tears in her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder how their lives had come to this. But deep down, she knew that she would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family. As the days turned into weeks, Sue found herself reluctantly continuing to advertise her husband's services to different ladies in Nairobi. With each new client that came knocking on her door, her heart grew heavier with sorrow, but she knew that it was the only way to keep their heads above water. One evening, as Sue sat alone in their modest home, there was a flurry of activity outside. Curious, she peeked through the curtains to see a group of women gathered on her doorstep, their voices rising in excitement. Word had spread like wildfire, and David's reputation as the most sought-after weekend companion in Nairobi had reached new heights. As Sue opened the door to greet the eager crowd, she was met with a cacophony of voices, each woman clamoring for David's attention. "He's mine," one woman exclaimed, her eyes flashing with determination. "No, he's mine," another countered, her voice filled with desperation. Sue watched in disbelief as the women fought amongst themselves, each one vying for the chance to spend a weekend with her husband. She couldn't help but feel a sense of shame wash over her, knowing that her marriage had become nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. But despite her reservations, Sue knew that she had no choice but to continue playing the role of the dutiful wife, even as her heart broke into a million pieces. And so, as the women continued to fight over David's affections, Sue retreated into the shadows, her spirit crushed by the weight of their poverty and desperation. As the chaos unfolded before her, Sue couldn't help but wonder how their lives had come to this. But deep down, she knew that she would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family. And as the sun set on another day in Nairobi, Sue was left alone with her thoughts, praying for a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded her. Amidst the chaos of competing voices and clamoring women, Sue stood her ground, her eyes scanning the group with a mix of resignation and determination. She knew that if she was going to continue down this path, she had to ensure that the price was right. "Ladies, please," Sue called out, her voice barely audible above the din. "If you want to spend the weekend with David, you'll have to make it worth our while." The women fell silent, their eyes turning to Sue with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They knew that if they wanted to win David's affections, they would have to dig deep into their pockets. One by one, the women began to offer up increasingly large sums of money, each one desperate to outbid the others for the chance to win David's companionship. But as the bidding war escalated, it became clear that one woman was willing to go to greater lengths than the rest. It was Mrs. Thompson, a wealthy socialite with a penchant for extravagance. With a flick of her wrist, she produced a wad of cash, her eyes gleaming with determination. "I'll give you double what anyone else is offering," Mrs. Thompson declared, her voice dripping with confidence. "Just let me take David for the weekend, and the money is yours." Sue hesitated for a moment, torn between her desire to provide for her family and her growing sense of unease at the spectacle unfolding before her. But in the end, the lure of financial security proved too great to resist. With a heavy heart, Sue accepted Mrs. Thompson's offer, knowing that she had sold a piece of her soul in exchange for a fleeting glimpse of stability. And as Mrs. Thompson whisked David away into the night, leaving Sue behind with a heavy heart and tears in her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder what had become of their once simple and happy life. But deep down, she knew that she would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family. And as she counted the money in her hand, Sue prayed for a brighter tomorrow in the midst of the darkness that surrounded her. Weeks turned into a blur for David as he found himself in the lavish embrace of Mrs. Thompson's world. What started as a weekend fling stretched into 3 long weeks, with David losing track of time and losing himself in the opulence that surrounded him. Under Mrs. Thompson's watchful eye, David was transformed. He was pampered and indulged, his every whim catered to with a kind of extravagance he had never known. Slowly but surely, he began to forget the life he had left behind, the wife who waited for him with a heavy heart. As the days stretched into weeks, Sue found herself consumed by worry and desperation. Her husband's absence weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the sacrifices they had made in their quest for survival. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Sue mustered the courage to pick up the phone and dial Mrs. Thompson's number. With trembling fingers, she waited as the phone rang, her heart pounding in her chest with a mixture of fear and hope. "Hello." Mrs. Thompson's voice crackled through the receiver, her tone cool and distant. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Sue," Sue replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I need to speak to David. It's urgent." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Mrs. Thompson responded, her voice laced with thinly veiled annoyance. "I'm afraid David is unavailable at the moment," Mrs. Thompson said curtly. "He's been quite busy with other matters." Sue's heart sank as she realized the gravity of the situation. She knew that she had to do something, anything, to bring her husband back home where he belonged. "But he's my husband," Sue pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "I need to speak to him. Please, Mrs. Thompson, I'm begging you." But Mrs. Thompson was unmoved by Sue's pleas, her resolve as cold and unyielding as the steel of a blade. "I'm sorry, Sue," Mrs. Thompson said icily. "But David is with me now. And he's not coming back." With those words, the line went dead, leaving Sue alone with her thoughts and her fears. And as she stared at the phone in her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, she knew that their once happy life had been shattered beyond repair. With a heart heavy with determination and desperation, Sue marched up to the imposing gates of Mrs. Thompson's mansion, her fists clenched at her sides as she prepared to face the woman who had stolen her husband away. As the security guard opened the gate, Sue's resolve hardened like steel. She stormed through the lavish gardens, her steps echoing against the marble floors as she made her way to Mrs. Thompson's front door. With a trembling hand, Sue pounded on the door, her knuckles white with anger and fear. She waited impatiently, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she braced herself for the confrontation that lay ahead. When the door finally swung open, Sue met with the sight of Mrs. Thompson standing before her, her expression a mixture of surprise and disdain. "What do you want?" Mrs. Thompson demanded, her voice dripping with contempt. "I want my husband back," Sue replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want David." But Mrs. Thompson's response was cold and dismissive, her eyes narrowing with disdain as she looked down her nose at Sue. "David is with me now," Mrs. Thompson said icily. "And he's not going anywhere." Enraged by Mrs. Thompson's carelessness, Sue felt a surge of anger course through her veins. Without a second thought, she launched herself at Mrs. Thompson, her fists flying as she fought to break free from the chains of despair that bound her. But before Sue could land a single blow, she felt strong arms pulling her away, dragging her kicking and screaming from Mrs. Thompson's mansion. As the security guard tossed her unceremoniously onto the street, Sue felt a sense of defeat wash over her. She knew that she had lost this battle, but she refused to give up the fight for her husband's love. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Sue vowed to never stop fighting for David, no matter the cost. And as she walked away from Mrs. Thompson's mansion, her heart heavy with sorrow and determination, she knew that their journey was far from over. Fueled by desperation and a fierce determination, Sue refused to accept defeat. With trembling hands, she dialed the emergency number for the police, her voice steady as she explained the situation to the dispatcher on the other end of the line. Within minutes, a squad car arrived at Mrs. Thompson's mansion, its sirens wailing as officers spilled out onto the street, ready to intervene in the escalating conflict. Sue watched with bated breath as the officers approached Mrs. Thompson's front door, their expressions grim and determined. With a nod from their commanding officer, they forced their way inside, ready to extract David from the clutches of his captor. Inside the mansion, chaos erupted as the police confronted Mrs. Thompson, demanding that she release David into their custody. But Mrs. Thompson was not about to give up without a fight, her voice rising in protest as she clung to David with a vice-like grip. But the police were relentless, their resolve unwavering as they fought to pry David from Mrs. Thompson's grasp. With a mighty effort, they managed to wrestle him free, dragging him kicking and screaming from the mansion as Mrs. Thompson looked on in fury and disbelief. As David was shoved into the back of a police Land Cruiser, his eyes met Sue's across the chaos, the flicker of recognition sparking in their depths. And in that moment, Sue knew that they had won a small victory in the battle to reclaim their lives. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Sue watched as the police car disappeared into the night, carrying David away from the mansion and back into her arms where he belonged. And as the sounds of the sirens faded into the distance, Sue knew that their journey was far from over. But with David by her side once more, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that their love would carry them through even the darkest of times. Days passed with a heavy weight on Sue's heart as she awaited David's release from the police station. When the moment finally arrived, and David stepped out into the sunlight, Sue rushed forward, her eyes brimming with tears of relief and remorse. "David," she choked out, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never should have." But before she could finish her sentence, David pulled her into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around her as he held her close. "It's okay, Sue," he whispered, his voice soft and reassuring. "We'll get through this together." Tears streamed down Sue's cheeks as she buried her face in David's chest, overcome with gratitude for his forgiveness. She knew that she had made mistakes, but with David by her side, she was determined to make things right. As they stood there in each other's arms, Sue knew that their journey was far from over. But with love and forgiveness guiding their way, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together, they could overcome anything. And as the sun set on another day in Nairobi, Sue and David walked hand in hand into the future, their hearts filled with hope and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.